Digital assets has become a maligned technology, and it's forcing a number of federal and state legislators to take policy decisions that many believe are ill-advised. Certainly, I believe that. FTX hasn't helped. FTX was an offshore fraud. But in trying to find that convenient scapegoat, the whole of the digital asset industry is often thrown into that bucket. There are already laws for prosecuting fraud. So then legislatures have to figure out some other action to make it look like they're tough. Now, I'm not saying that a number of regulations are important to get right, but when we start to drop down to the state level, they are often reacting to what they perceive as potentially a vacuum at the federal level, as well as their belief that their constituency will reward them for looking tough on digital assets. Maybe that's a bit cynical, but at any rate, the drive to regulate from multiple national and state levels creates a tic-tac-toe board of regulations that may become very difficult to navigate in interstate commerce in the future. The problem is once we layer in all these regulations and we don't contemplate how other national or state regulators and legislatures are applying these regulations, it can really constrain in a way that has unforeseen consequences. So if you're listening to this podcast anyway, highly likely you already agree that having multiple layers of regulation at the national and state levels, at different agency and legislative levels, can really make things difficult to navigate. But what's happening at the state level is very significant. An individual state may not get the attention of the digital asset industry, but collectively, it starts to create a real drag, or could create a real drag, on the economy. Absent federal preemption, we may get the federal posture that we ultimately want, only to run into the buzzsaw of state-level regulations times 50. Illinois and New Jersey, and no doubt I'm missing others, are battleground states to get right. Whether the experience there is positive or negative, hopefully it shapes other states' response and reduces the risk of proposing regulation for digital assets with unforeseen consequences. So today, I have Gabriella Kusz, Chief Executive Officer of Global Digital Asset and Cryptocurrency Association, as well as Nina Kaplan, the Chair of the New Jersey Digital Asset Working Group, on the podcast to discuss. I think you'll enjoy it. If you like this podcast, please share it with others. And in fact, this particular podcast really needs to get the word out because funding is tight for these initiatives, and it takes a village. It takes possibly you to contribute. I've contributed. So at any rate, I highly encourage you to listen to this episode and to think more deeply about the implications of these small pockets. So with that, I bring you Gabriella Kusz and Nina Kaplan. Welcome to The Encrypted Economy, a podcast exploring the business, laws, regulation, security, and technologies relating to digital assets and data. I am Eric Hess, founder of Hess Legal Counsel, and your host. Join me on this journey, exploring the reach of these transformative technologies. Really excited to have Nina Kaplan, Chair of the New Jersey Digital Asset Working Group, and Gabriella Kusz, Chief Executive Officer of the Global Digital Asset and Cryptocurrency Association. Welcome.
Thank you.
Great to be here. Thank you, Eric.
So we have a lot to talk about today because a lot of attention has often been given to the state of affairs with regard to federal regulation of digital asset, but a lot is starting to brew at the state level. Now, we've always had money services business licensing, and with New York being one of the more, how should I say, involved or onerous to get approval for. But we recently have had some regulation proposed at the state level. At New Jersey and Illinois has gotten a lot of attention. But before we start to delve into that, I'm going to ask each of you, what's your background and what drew you to this space? Maybe we'll start off with Nina and then to Gabby.
Well, I got involved in the space around 2017 when I helped organize some of the first hearings on blockchain for the state of New Jersey. I worked with the Science, Innovation, and Tech Committee and just was committed to blockchain. The governor's, one of his campaign pledges was to make New Jersey the Silicon Valley of the East. So I wanted to help. And I know New Jersey wanted to be a tech leader. So that's how I got started.
All right. And Gabby?
Sure. So I kind of got into this because I had done a lot of work in international economic and financial sector development. And there were a lot of people in the digital asset space who were trying to navigate a lot of ambiguity and complexity in legal and regulatory, and were interested in trying to clarify things. And wouldn't you know it, a lot of the experience I had with creating self-regulatory organizations or SROs for the accountancy profession actually lent itself really nicely to trying to create sort of legal and regulatory clarity for the digital asset industry. So that's how I got involved.
Excellent. Excellent. So do you think that what's going on at the state level is getting the attention, I guess, in the digital asset community and even beyond that it should be getting?
No, not at all. I think, in all honesty, some of it I think is due to the fact that, there's a lot going on in DC right now with regards to the various agency crackdowns, the issues around debanking. And I think in general, most of the associations that exist, their effort has been very much based around DC. And so this has been a little bit of a blind spot. The other piece of it is that you have state associations that are still kind of getting their feet under them. This is still a relatively new industry. And so these are generally heavily volunteer-based state-level associations. They don't have hired lobbyists that do like advocacy for them yet. So, it's a little bit of a blind spot, I think, for the industry as a whole.
Yeah, in fact, Gabby was one of the first to really have the foresight to recognize the importance of states and state legislation. Other people I spoke with did not see it as well as she has. But I think other people are starting to realize how important the states are going to become.
It's interesting because even at the state level, with a lot of the focus on securities regulation and whether something should be, the registration process, what's often missed is that, Regulation A, Tier 2 and an S1, they get the federal exemption from federal registration. But even if the SEC kind of said, okay, we fix the disclosure regime tomorrow, only those securities that would register as that would get the exemption by statute. So you would still have state by state registration requirements, and the NASAA, the National Association of Securities Administrators Association, they've been very active in trying to prevent a broader federal exemption for securities, even apart from digital assets. So we haven't even entered the phase where state securities regulators potentially get involved. Do you think that when the New Jersey and Illinois are contemplating these broader regimes, are they thinking through that this layers on yet another layer on top of whatever the state securities regulators deem to do with regards to digital assets?
In New Jersey, that wasn't the case. This legislation, the licensing regime, the Digital Asset Blockchain Technology Act in New Jersey, NJ 1756, came about really because an assemblywoman several years ago had 3 constituents who were cheated in a Bitcoin ATM scam. And that motivated her to work on this very ambitious legislation. Although she didn't work on legislation to ban Bitcoin ATMs or to punish bad actors, it became this very ambitious bill.
Gabby, what do you think about Illinois for that?
Yeah, so it's very similar, like the story. It's not again, it's about state constituents being harmed. So in Illinois, there was a Ponzi scheme that actually, upon further reflection, had very little, in fact, to do with crypto. It was just an old-fashioned Ponzi scheme that leveraged the brand or concept of cryptocurrency. And because this had hurt, in particular, individuals in the Hispanic American community in a part of Chicago, this was something that had drawn attention, and quite honestly, and rightly so, under the banner of consumer protection. But I think that issue area, again, in the broader state of play that we're seeing in the environment around a post-FTX world, I think this got amplified. And so correctly, the state of Illinois was trying to create legislation that would appropriately license and would try to minimize any type of illicit behaviors or harms against consumers, as well as to protect market integrity. The issue is the same that we had with Nina, which is that the intentions were good to try to reduce, these instances of inappropriate behavior towards consumers. The problem is that the legislation as it was drafted, it goes well beyond what you would have seen for like the New York State bit license, for example. And we can delve into some of the specifics of it later, but suffice it to say that it was a significantly larger scope package than just addressing some of the challenges with regards to consumer protection.
And how do you think the FTX has impacted it? Was that part of the motivation for accelerating it, or do you think it was already well in play by the time FTX sort of filtered into public consciousness?
In my experience, it really accelerated things. And we found that lobbyists, a lot of people in the industry had lost credibility in DC among lawmakers. And that definitely happened in New Jersey, where lawmakers said they really had lost trust in a lot of people in the industry. And actually, they complained to me that they felt antagonized by some lawmakers who they felt weren't being honest about risks and ways to protect consumers. So definitely, FTX definitely had a huge impact.
Yeah, and I would agree with that as well. I think, one was the effect of FTX. And then I think the other piece that you're seeing play out and why this is trickling down to the state level is that it's not getting addressed at a federal legislative level. So now you have a lot of state, and again, there's pressure on state regulators to do something in order to protect consumers in their state. And if the federal government isn't stepping in, then they're kind of left with no other choice but to try to create something that works for their state. And I think that's where, again, from the side of like trying to work collaboratively, which is something that the Global DCA does, as well as New Jersey Digital Asset Working Group, this isn't us against regulators or us against legislators. It's us trying to work with regulators and legislators to do something that works for this state, this industry, and consumers. So it's a little bit of a different take, maybe.
Right. And so New Jersey, if you read the New Jersey statute, it's you can sit down, you can read it, and you can be done with it in 5 or 10 minutes. You sit down with the Illinois Digital Asset Regulation Act, DARA, and you're just like, oh my God, like, what do I do here? So, I mean, there's two major components of the Illinois DARA. One is the Money Transmission Modernization Act. The other one is licensing for any digital business activity. Now, there are concerns with acting in an unlicensed fashion in the scope of the statute, which we'll get to, but there's something very unique to Illinois that I guess none of the other states that have broached it to date is this concept of application to transfers of digital assets versus transmission. Do you want to kind of expand on that a little bit and its significance?
Sure. I think it's important to kind of just recognize that transmission is not the same thing as transfer. So, a transmitter, that's just an intermediary business. It takes temporary custody of a customer's value to transfer that value on behalf of the customer, right? Transfers apply much more broadly. And, as part of Illinois DARA, that's where this has had this extensive, potentially very harmful and impactful influence in the digital asset space. Transfer means individuals transfer value all the time as part of their daily life. It would be largely improper to regulate just a transfer as a business activity requiring approval from the state. So if I transfer value to you out of my personal account to your personal account, that would somehow be something that would potentially need approval from the state. And it's funny because DARA does that for digital assets, but not when fiat money is involved. Okay. So it's a little bit also not just a misuse of this concept of transfer versus transmittal, but it's also this issue of an unequal application of the law based on and somewhat potentially discriminatory against digital assets. Okay. The main piece of this that I think is important to kind of come through is that, like I said, DARA applies to all transfers of digital assets, not only transmissions. And because it applies to the individual, it has implications for personal or like non-business interactions with the uses of digital assets. And so, yes, the legislation tries to enhance robust consumer protection, but those provisions, that doesn't necessarily advance that cause. And so that's, I think, where we kind of take issue with and are looking to try to enhance that piece of legislation.
Right. And common to both statutes is a more expansive definition of what constitutes a digital asset. Nina, do you want to talk about it from the New Jersey perspective before we?
Yeah, well, in New Jersey, it was really pushing forth half-baked licensing regime to sweep a massive amount of economic activity that's really non-financial in nature. So, and it ended up working as a de facto ban. So it's an extremely broad definition, which encompasses everything from Bitcoin itself to that, people would have to register, to projects like JPM's Onyx, things like IBM's supply chain blockchain implementations, and NFTs, which are literally just art.
Right. And would it also apply to things like identity NFTs that were being transmitted?
Yes, everything.
Right. So that's pretty broad. What about Illinois? Do we have the same broadness there being proposed?
Yeah. So, it's the same concept. The idea of what constitutes both a digital asset and then a digital asset business are extremely expansive. And so when we looked at the law, we looked at the fact that it could include, just people who were blockchain enthusiasts who were creating NFTs in their college dormitory. And these are the types of activities that would have significant civil penalties assigned to, it was something like up to, tens of thousands of dollars of fines on a daily basis for not being licensed and for engaging in these types of activities. And when you're talking about, especially an emerging technology, you want people to engage with this, especially in their personal capacities, so that they're learning, building, growing. That's the beginning or the nature of how entrepreneurship buds and sprouts, how you're going to develop businesses. And at the end of the day, close to 80 to 90% of all job creation happens through small and medium enterprises. They're rightly considered your economic engines of growth because that's where jobs come from. So when we stifle the ability for individual entrepreneurs to grow and build in this new digital economy, be mindful that you are stifling the main driver of economic growth and job creation. And so that's where it's not that this can go completely unbridled. We don't disagree with that, but there has to be some level of thoughtful legislation and regulation that allows for businesses to grow, develop, and to fold into an appropriate licensing regime that helps to create that consumer protection, market integrity, but also that nurtures innovation and growth.
Now, Chicago is often considered the heart of the commodities space industry, is like, grew up in Chicago, right? Equities was New York, commodities was Chicago. That's sort of what you typically think. So there's a very robust economy built around commodities. And yet, when we contemplate even federal regulation, there's this push and pull between commodities and securities. And certainly if a lot of digital assets were deemed to be commodities, then it would seem that it would be a problem if Chicago had this extremely restrictive regulation surrounding those commodities when so many of the commodity businesses are located in Chicago.
No, we completely agree. And I think it was only just last week that, Chicago was noted as being, one of the top 10 fintech cities in both Illinois and then in the country. And so, when we look at what it is that's driving investment, innovation, job creation, and growth, and we look at some of the problems we have as a city and as a state from a budgetary perspective, all of these things have to come into balance. And I think when we talk about making sure that there is balanced regulation, that's one of the key pieces that we're looking at, is ensuring that we're nurturing these global financial centers of excellence and creating them. And proper legislation and regulation is definitely an important piece of that. But it has to be legislation and regulation that nurtures the development and the healthy growth of an industry and doesn't snuff out the flame of what could be sort of the next wave of development and opportunity for a city or state, right? And so I think, and Nina probably agrees with this as well, nobody does digital assets or blockchain for digital assets or blockchain. That's ridiculous. You do it for social outcomes you're trying to have, access to finance, financial inclusion. You do it for, national security issues. So we have, builders who are building to try to enhance supply chain logistics through digital asset usage and freight financing. We have people that are building to title to the blockchain so that it makes it easier, less costly, and hopefully more streamlined for all people to gain access to property titling and housing. We have, all of these different types of groups of people that build and use digital assets. None of them are using it for what I think is mainly seen as the mainstream view, which is trading and speculative behavior. The majority of people who are trying to build and grow, especially small businesses, they're using it to try to build a next wave of innovation and opportunity for people, for businesses, and for jobs and the state economy, quite honestly.
So breaking it down by state, what do you think the burden is associated with the proposed licensing regimes? What would it entail for businesses to become licensed? Obviously, if all transfers are prohibited, then it makes it really hard for individuals because they're not going to go through the licensing regime. But a business but putting that aside, I would imagine some regulators would say, well, we don't mean that if Johnny sends, USDC to Mary, he's subject to fines. I think they would say that's not reasonable. But but even pushing some of the more unreasonable implications aside, which I wouldn't, which obviously has to be addressed. That's just logical. But pushing that aside, if they say anybody who's engaged in that business with regards to, if they are transferring digital assets, I think you raised what it does to just even enterprise level or supply chain or a lot of just uses that really doesn't have anything to do with, trading crypto. It implicates that as well. But for these businesses, for people who are engaged in such businesses, what is the burden, from a statutory perspective for, to become a licensed digital asset business? Let's say we'll start off with New Jersey.
Well, if we give the example, let's say you're an artist who wants to create an experimental NFT project where, according to this legislation, you are a digital asset issuer. Here are some of the rules that you have to comply with. Risking your license being revoked if you fail to provide documents requested by the department. No restriction on the type delivery of policies and procedures to be adopted by the artist to meet any obligations required by anti-money laundering and anti-terror financing laws to the department, providing a copy of the artist's audited financial statements for the most recent fiscal year, complete and total schedule of the following. I mean, it goes on and on. And penalties of $500 a day for noncompliance. So I don't even know how an artist would be able to comply with this, or students, or startups. So it's...
And what is the discretion of the regulator in requiring this? Do they have like the authority to request additional documentation, impose additional requirements?
Sure. I believe so.
Okay. And Gabby, what about Illinois? What's the burden there?
So before we get into like some of the actual burden, I want to just kind of back up a little bit and talk a bit about, what it all entails to get to the point of getting licensed. So, a lot of times we talk about how, and you'll hear the fact that people are like, well, the licensing fees are very inexpensive. And while that may be true, the legal fees to get to the point of being licensed or to go back and forth with the regulator, because that all costs lawyer hours, which are billable hours and are very expensive. I think when we were looking at New Jersey and when we looked at Illinois DARA, we reflected back on the experience in the state of Illinois, and you're talking about on average $100,000 to get to that point. So it's not like this small hurdle. And that's when everything is clear and that process has been in existence for a while. Okay. So now you have new processes that come into play. In particular with Illinois DARA, like one of the things that we have pushed back and we are glad that there is some discussion and dialogue on is the lack of a phase-in timeline. So on day one, this would become law. So the question then begs, what does that mean? So is everybody literally illegal on the first day that this becomes law? How are you going to phase this in? How are we going to ensure that there's not a backlog? Because then people's businesses could potentially be operating outside the scope of licensing if this process is not handled smoothly with enough funding, sufficient capacity in order to move the licenses through the process, right? So normally there's some form of grandfathering, which would allow for businesses that are at least in existence as of the date of beginning of this type of an enactment to have a grace period or some period of transition to come into play. Okay. So that's kind of the first piece to think about. The second piece to think about then is the definition of a digital asset business activity in Illinois, which means any of the following: exchanging, transferring, or storing a digital asset, okay? Or engaging in digital asset administration. And the best part was any other business activity involving digital assets designated by rule by the department as may be necessary and appropriate for the protection of residents. So literally, it sounds like anything and everything. And that's where it goes well beyond what we're talking about. So some of the fines that could, scale up if you're not licensed, we've kind of chatted a little bit about that before. But you're talking about this concept of like up to $100,000 a day of fine. So the few $100s a day that were stated for New Jersey, this has been put a bit on steroids for the state of Illinois. These are things
seems
that,
like a bargain.
Again, yeah, actually, like I think about it and I'm like, oh, wow.
God, I only have to pay $3,500, but there's probably, and then I got to comply, but still.
And look, like some of these things, they're not like wrong. So in order to apply for a license, it's anti-money laundering, cybersecurity program, business continuity plan, operational security program, anti-fraud program, unregistered securities risk plan, conflict of interest program, and specific topics within each of these that must be addressed. Okay. None of those are wrong, but like at the same time, when we're talking about some of these pieces, these are very intense levels that you would expect of maybe like a medium-sized business. But now you're talking about like, let's say it's a one-person startup that's kind of getting their feet under them and looking to get licensed. that's where I think when we talk about the edges of innovation and making sure that we're creating an enabling environment, this is not enabling, this is chilling.
Right. And these are not, and these are not just simply, you have to have these policies, which would be burdensome enough. These are policies that have to be approved, correct?
Yeah. So these would have to be in place to apply for a license. So you didn't even get approval yet. This is applying.
Right. And you wouldn't get it, but it's subject to the review for sufficiency.
That's right. And yeah, as Gabby pointed out, the 2014 bid license, they say it caused an exodus of companies out of the state because some companies said, she pointed out, the legal fees, the fines were pretty small, but the legal fees, some companies said they paid $300,000 or $500,000 to get the license, and they had to had compliance officers change their compliance program, change software, apart from all the documentation that the law firms had to help them prepare.
And then there's ongoing compliance as well, and examination, right?
Yeah. And I think there's another piece of it too, which is that let's say you met all of these application requirements. The secretary can still unilaterally determine that the applicant doesn't command the confidence of the community and deny the application. And so I think those are some things that, you have to understand and also, put this into play. So now let's say that I'm looking at a place where I want to base my business or start to build. If I could just randomly be unilaterally determined that I don't have the confidence of the community, my business can be shut down, my license can be revoked, and you're not entitled to a hearing.
It's kind of broad discretion, huh? And denial of due process, I would say as well.
And it's not easy for these, the Department of Banking and Insurance in New Jersey is going to have to hire a lot more people, and that gets costly.
Well, that's also that's an important point to touch on, is that, it's one thing to create this structure and to say, oh, we're going to be very protective, and we can, certainly it's onerous. But when you think about what it means from the other side, I mean, you look at New York, for example, and I know New York has struggled with this. They view, and they have a fairly developed banking department that's assigned to this. They have trained people, and they are still resource constrained, and they still struggle. And it still takes close to 2 years to get a license from New York because, they are resourced, it takes a lot to process it in accordance with the standards that the state has set. And it's considered like if you are, because basically every state has an MSB regime, money services business, if you engage in any kind of transmission. So it's not like Illinois even needs necessarily to have another money transmit. There's already a licensing requirement in Illinois. There's already a licensing requirement in New Jersey as it relates to money transmission. But of all the states that you have to go through to run the gauntlet to get this licensing, New York is considered the most onerous. And it takes like close to 2 years. And the fact that both of these, both Illinois and New Jersey, have largely pointed to New York as a model, but yet expanded upon it without even necessarily addressing the staffing and the resourcing and the lack of expertise associated with it, is just, okay, like you're creating this colossus that by definition, just like, it's just never going to work. Like anybody, it's just pain and misery for anybody involved. Like, like
this is 2023, we're talking bid license, that's 2014. So it's ignoring, a lot of technological advances. So, it's really, it doesn't make any sense.
Let's talk a little bit about, oh, sorry, Gabby.
No, I was just going to kind of say the same thing. There's a lot of, and I think there's a few things just to kind of keep in mind, because I want to be recognizing the positive work of each of these states in trying to move forward, and the fact that they're operating under very difficult pressures, right? So they have state consumers that are, having to deal with misinformation, disinformation, but also potential fraudulent activities. They are dealing with a lack of leadership and guidance from federal levels so that they have clarity in which to operate. And so this is like a task that is falling on them. And to which I think, again, like what we've found to be very constructive is actually having conversations and trying to work through these pieces of legislation, because at the end of the day, Nobody's like out there trying to shut crypto down. It's about trying to create legal and regulatory frameworks that actually work for a state, its people, and the industry. And so when we focus conversations on those aspects, you actually have, I think, a better, more constructive outcome. And that's why I think, again, these are steps that state level regulators are trying to take in order to allow and enable this to operate safely within their state borders, okay? But then it's incumbent on industry to meet them halfway and to work with them, I think, to bring it over the edge. And I think that given some of the overly politicized environment that we live in, that's become extremely difficult to do. And again, in the wake of FTX, there's been a black brush that has, kind of been broadcast across the entire industry. But I think making sure that people understand the real narrative around what this industry is, what its value and utility is, and what it will be is very important because it's still emerging just yet.
So one of the things I was noting before was the fact that there is like an MSB regime in 50 states. And in some of them, there's reciprocity, which is makes it a lot easier than having to think of 50 individual states with their own unique requirements. How does New Jersey and Illinois contemplate reciprocity for similar regimes?
I personally think it's important to work together. That's why I've been supporting. Gabby supported us, and I want to support her. And I do believe in working together with other states to have maybe a more uniform approach. I think that would, is important.
But New Jersey actually does contemplate reciprocity. It has to be applied for and the approval has to be granted. So it is it's noted, but it's discretionary. Gabby, how about Illinois?
Yeah, so I think reciprocity was envisioned. I think one of the pieces that, again, as this type of legislation, bubbles up and as Nina and I kind of play this gotcha, catch you, try to put you on a right path in terms of going state by state, I think there's an opportunity. Like I said, you have regulators and legislators that are trying to create legislation, and that legislation seems to be able to move quickly. Those are the pros, okay? The cons are that a lot of times you're dealing with counterparts who maybe do not have access to the expertise, the level of, development of what's happening in the industry, or what some of the unintended consequences of the legislation can be, how it would be applied in practice. Because it's one thing to pass legislation. That usually takes 20% of your energy. 80% of your energy when you do legal and regulatory reform like I have goes towards adoption and implementation of that legislation in practice. So that's where things get very sticky. And I think if I'm looking at, again, the pros, I see the fact that there's will, interest, and movement. So where there are those qualities, if they are directed towards positive outcomes, both for the state as well as for industry, then you can make a significant amount of change. And that's why I think I do applaud the states that are trying to move forward, okay? What I think maybe needs to happen more effectively from the side of industry, and which is what Nina, myself, and many others at the state level who run state level associations are trying to do, is to be more proactive about reaching out, having early discussions with state legislators and regulators about what global best practice for subnational, so state level legislation looks like for a digital asset licensing regime. And in that way, what you can hope to do is to target kind of those key areas that we know are challenging. And these revolve around centralized digital asset enterprises, okay? Helping them with an appropriate definition of what a digital asset is, as well as what a digital asset business is. And if we can go similar to the strategy that seems to be rolling out state by state and just kind of be a little bit ahead of the curve with helping to shape that legislation in a way that has that balanced approach so that the states get the economic benefits and the social outcomes that they want to have. And they also have the industry development and growth that they're looking to nurture. I think what you'll find is a very high degree, potentially, of harmonization or consistency across states, which plays to the benefit of a national strategy when it comes to legal and regulatory reform here in the US. And again, you can have then stagnation at a federal level, but it doesn't cut off the economic opportunity that should be driving down to the states. Okay. So that's kind of why I say pros, lots of interest, lots of fast movement. That's not necessarily a bad thing. The cons are that we just need to help shape some of what we may see as, like again, unforeseen, unintentional consequences, helping to direct, again, consumer protection efforts towards those actions that will actually protect consumers and ensure that there's that balance when it comes to, in particular, helping to nurture decentralized finance or DeFi, helping to create an enabling environment for, decentralized autonomous organizations or DAOs, and really helping to foment that next wave of economic growth, innovation, and change here in the US.
And one thing we found, both of us found, was that whereas at the federal level, things take a long time, at the state level, legislation can happen fast. And that happened to both of us. It was very quick. And all of a sudden there was unanimous support in the New Jersey Senate for this, before we even had a chance. So I had to mobilize and organize a group very quickly. And then, but just have conversations myself and, at the last minute to get this bill paused, but they only gave us 2 weeks to propose a rewrite, 2 weeks. So without funding, we had Gabby's help and, help from attorneys, but 2 weeks is just, we managed to, provide something, but it's just not enough time. And so we wanted to help our counterparts in other states. So if they find themselves in this situation, we don't want them to go through what we went through, sleepless nights, working 24/7, pressuring people who are working as, volunteers to get something done. And I think Gabby had even less time, to prepare. That happened very quickly in Illinois.
Yeah, ours was, the bill had actually moved out of committee. We had about, I'd say, between the time when it moved out of committee and it was heard in hearing to provide redlining and comments back, roughly 8 hours. So we had to, I know. So, and the funny thing is people often laugh about my background, having worked in crisis industries and countries in conflict and post-conflict. And I'm like, you want to know something funny? All those skills are coming really in handy right about now. So I knew how to mobilize, and we had a team of lawyers. Actually, you were one of them, if I'm not mistaken, Eric,
Yep.
who volunteered. Yeah, I know. Eric, snaps for Eric. Well done. And what I've done is actually start to document all of the things that we have gone through, all of the requests for fundraising, all of the, urgent action alerts, all of this, even some of the templates and the JPEGs that we've used to try to raise awareness and actually putting that into sort of a rapid response toolkit. I used to manage a portfolio of associations in very dicey political, social, economic conditions. And so one of the things you learn very early on is how to take lessons learned and transfer them over so that maybe if I have to go through this with such a rapid amount of response and very little support and capacity, how can I teach you to be able to do that 10 times faster with, a quarter of the resources and to be, 3 times more successful? And that's where again, nobody's paying us to do this, but we just decided to take, yeah, I know, Nina knows. So I just kind of said, I'm like, listen, we got all the state associations that, we knew together. And I kind of said, listen, we will give you access to our kind of brain dump right now. It's not cleaned up and in a formal toolkit format yet. but I want you to have this as soon as possible so that you know, and we'll talk you through how you would break a team of 5 to 10 lawyers into groups to scour legislation within a matter of hours so that you can have something reasonable. We'll give you the definition of a digital asset and the definition of a digital asset business that we've worked through for our own purposes. You should look at it and make sure that it's tailored and it matches the context of your state. But, if everything else you don't have time, go for the digital asset enterprise definition and the definition of a digital enterprise, definition of a digital asset, because that's kind of the core piece that usually anchors a lot of this legal and regulatory approach. And if that is wrong, then everything is wrong. So it's kind of like triaging, identifying, prioritizing, sequencing in a very rapid fashion when you don't have a lot of time or resources, and really helping people understand how to manage and project and program manage an association that's in a period of crisis.
Yeah. We had one person that I admire a lot is Lee Schneider, and he has a great definition of digital assets. We proposed it, that was rejected, and he said it's been rejected federally as well. But, we try to work with writers like Lee who, can have real, the definition is obviously really important. So.
And I think too, one of the other pieces that, and Nina has been doing an excellent job in gathering kind of a coalition of state associations together, is this concept of, I may be, in sort of the hot seat today, but it may be you tomorrow. So we're all going to kind of just round each other up and say, okay, we're going to lean this way if it's this state, and try to kind of pool our knowledge, expertise to help you. And if it's your state tomorrow, then we'll be there to support you. And I think that some of that sort of collective action and mobilization of industry representatives has been extremely important in being able to stand up, in a holistic manner, a very strong sort of a pushback. And like I said, it's not as much even of a pushback as it is a pull in. So working more collaboratively. And I think training associations on how to work collaboratively, that's another piece of this, because again, that used to be my whole job. So I know that it doesn't come automatically. Like some people maybe have it from other experiences that they've had or other work that they've done. But to the degree that we're able to help people, I'm happy to speak with other state associations. You lead, you own your state, mantra, voice, perspective, and strategy. But if there's something I can do in terms of backstop, or offering guidance or connecting you in terms of network, we're more than happy to do that. And I think that has also resonated very well, which is that you are the best spokesperson for your state. You live in that state, you pay taxes in that state, you know that state, and you love that state. So how do we help you get the outcomes you need for your state? And that respect, I think, of, state level leadership is something that has really, I think, fomented really positive outcomes.
Yeah, that's why one of the reasons I love Gabby is she jumped on board early on and recognized how important it was and offered support. And I want to be able to do that for, as I said, for other states and my counterparts. And we both want to, to help. So that's one thing I'm working on, and we hope to have some big announcements soon in that regard.
So where does the legislation sit in each of New Jersey and Illinois? Nina?
In New Jersey, I've been told it's on pause. There were some other, budget and other more important issues, but it will be revisited again. And
any idea of the timing on that revisitation?
I was told this summer. I was actually in Trenton, going to Trenton yesterday. And so that's what I've been told. But also some lawmakers were saying to me, well, blockchain technology is a little outdated and it's been replaced with better technology. So so we were discussing that point, and I said, that's not the case. And I was explaining to them something about digital money and, with FedNow's digital, digital program that's going to start around July, and CBDCs, and so just this is really the architecture for the future of money and finance, and so it's important to get it right, and so it's not, so that wasn't correct.
How about you, Gabby? Where's it sit now in terms of the state legislature?
Mm-hmm. So our bill is still live until May 19th. And so we are still actively organizing industry representatives. We are still actively fundraising to support our efforts downstate. And, we are very sincerely reaching out to all of your listeners in order to help support this, because, this is a chance. And I think sometimes, again, being the eternal optimist that I am, someone gives you lemons, you try to make lemonade, or, some type of awesome spiked lemonade, ideally, I would think. But I think from my side, looking at this and saying, well, listen, we have this movement of legislation moving really fast, probably not ideal. However, it's this really cool opportunity to work constructively with legislators and regulators to create global state-of-the-art legislation that would really do the thing that they're trying to do, which is consumer protection and market integrity, and at the same time draw businesses into Illinois, because it would be a licensing regime that would allow growth, that would be seen as giving clarity, because again, we may or may not have a resolution at a federal level. So if there's not going to be that, then it's going to be even more important what's happening at the state level. And so I think here, working, like I said, constructively to think about how you would position Chicago, just as you've positioned Singapore, just as you've positioned Dubai, in order to create a licensing or regulatory regime and to support the development and growth of a regulator in that space in a way that actually attracts and enables constructive, positive growth of the industry, that to me is something that I wouldn't pass up. And I think that that is the message that we have for our counterparts in the legislature and in regulators. And what I believe, again, this is a scary time to be in the industry, but it doesn't have to be. And that's where taking control of some of this narrative, working collaboratively and constructively, and having bright spots like what we're seeing come out of New Jersey, what we hope to see out of Illinois, will help lead maybe not only at a state level, but potentially at a national and even a global level.
So I have to ask this question, and I would say off the record, but I can't because it's on the record. But I saw some pitching of this, both by, I'm not going to name names, both by people in the industry and by people at the state legislative level, as saying this would bring jobs in the digital asset space to Illinois in its current form. And when you start to delve into this, it's hard to even imagine how that impression could have even taken, it's like, I mean, I could, New Jersey has its problems for sure. Right. But I could see somebody trying to spin that maybe a little bit. I don't know if I'd agree, but Illinois, there's I can't understand how you could even potentially spin something as draconian as the penalties and the expansiveness, and where did that come from?
I think it's not so much about, well, a few things. One, I think that there's been some, interesting activity with regards to certain actors in the space in our own industry, quite honestly, with regards to Illinois DARA. I think that there has been, again, some misinformation, disinformation about what the impacts would be. And I think that some of it has been done in ill will. I think, additionally, I think, though, that the intention of this was to try to create clarity, okay? And that's why it's always really good to understand the context in which a bill or a piece of legislation or regulation comes forward, what was the original intent and what is the impact you're trying to have? Because if it is consumer protection and if it is to try to push back on some of what we've seen both come out of FTX, but also out of this very unfortunate and inappropriate scam, Ponzi scheme that happened, then let's think about what that looks like and how you would create a regime that both sufficiently creates some level of order and structure to the development of this industry in a way so that you could minimize those negative outcomes, but also create sort of the positive, constructive creations that we've talked about, like jobs and social outcomes. And I think, what I will say is that, how do things get misconstrued? I don't know. That's for like above my pay grade. But I will say,
I don't want to make
feel
enemies,
like there's like whole groups of people.
I'm just confounded by it. That's why I asked. Sorry.
Whole groups of people. No, I mean, look, like I said, I don't know that, I don't believe, to be quite honest with you at all, that was the intention of the legislators or regulators who worked on this. I really don't. I think that the idea was to try to create something that did attract jobs, that did, create positive, constructive industry growth here. And I think that goodwill is able to be, engaged with in a way that helps them achieve their ultimate objective. And that also, I think, again, brings the jobs and the economic growth that people want. And I don't believe that that's a fallacy or, a mutually exclusive opportunity. I think it's really just about delving into some of the details on this, thinking about how this can be or would be applied in practice in order to minimize those unintentional outcomes. Because really, that's what we're talking about, are things that are unintended. And so if that's the case, then it's really just a matter of sitting down, working through the bill and trying to come to a level of compromise and agreement about how we achieve those ultimate objectives.
So in New Jersey, Nina was able to, working with the state legislatures, I guess, to pause and to get an opportunity to present something, which shows some receptivity to trying to get it right. And we hope that what comes out of it, will be something that gets it right. In Chicago, in Illinois, we heard you had 8 hours to turn something around, which doesn't sound like the most warm, welcome embrace. What is maybe a little color on, within the legislators? Is this something where there's like hawks that are sort of driving the process, or is it just a lack of education? Or is there a growing movement to sort of say, okay, to your point, you said it was originally intended as X. Is there a desire to kind of get it to something that works, or is this something that is still very much an uphill battle as far as you're concerned?
So I'll go first and then I'll let Nina kind of talk about her experience. I think it's a mixed bag, right? Like, you're not dealing with the best of, you're dealing with a post-collapse environment coming out of FTX. This is a lot of, again, headlines that continuously come out that are negative for the industry and that largely ignore the reality of like what the industry is actually doing and who comprises the quote unquote industry. Again, the Global DCA is one of the few, there's probably others, but one of the few associations that represents small and medium firms that are active in the digital asset space. And we do that very intentionally. It's not to our bottom line benefit to discount or to have low fees. We do that because we believe in equitable economic growth, which is different than a lot of other groups. So from our side, it's important that those small businesses be successful and they have an equal footing. I think when you talk about the degree to which there are, hawks or collaborators in legislature or in regulators, because this is, one, a new subject area, okay, as well as a doubly sophisticated subject area. And what do I mean by that? Well, it blends two really complicated and sophisticated subjects, technology and finance. And it's hard to even really get people that are good at either of those when we talk about, policy making. Okay. And so now you're having to have this very heavy lift around laying a foundation of education and knowledge, and then also having to explain the value and utility of something that is still very nascent. Okay. So I have to project outwards. So I can't give you 18 different companies that have been established for 20 years that are building this. I have to explain to you that today, this thing that is very small and innocuous may one day be the thing that changes the world. But I need you to come along on this journey with me and to build up to that point. Okay. So when you ask about legislators or regulators who are hawks or doves or supportive of this or not, I actually don't view people in either of those camps because it's too early to view anybody in either of those camps. And it is frustrating. Sometimes I get mad that people say things like digital assets have no value, digital assets aren't important. But I don't have the luxury of just writing someone off, right? It's my job to work to help people learn and change opinions and understand, because this is a new industry. And as somebody who's helped raise industries before, that is your whole job. So it's not enough to say, oh, these people don't agree with us, we just won't talk to them, or these people don't agree with us and they'll never agree with us. No, hun, that's the thing you're getting paid for, is to help those people understand. And if they don't understand it in the way you're describing it, the problem isn't them, it's you. You need to change the way you're messaging. You need to talk to them and understand what they value and help them help their constituents, right? Because this isn't going away. It's not a fad. And so that's the part that we talk about, like, again, drawing from like my economic development days. In an economic and financial sector transformation, it is the norm for people to be doubting, to be, cynical, to be, questioning, critical of an industry. And that is what you should wholly expect the first reaction of anyone to be who is confronted with this. It takes time. It takes a lot of meetings. It takes building a lot of trust to get people to understand why this is important to them and what it could mean for them if we were to develop this intentionally and strategically. And so that's the piece that I think people often miss, is that you don't really need a lobbyist. You need an educator, and you need people who are patient and are willing to take the time to sit down and walk through this step by step in order to bring common understanding. So almost a diplomat or a convening force as opposed to an adversarial force.
And develop someone who can develop trusting relationships is key right now. And I think that's partly why I was successful, because they said that lobbyists were kind of antagonizing some of the New Jersey lawmakers. And instead I said, well, actually, you didn't go far enough in these ways, because I didn't feel that the bill was really going to protect people. So I said, well, we didn't go far enough in protecting people in these ways. And so, just to find exactly what Gabby's saying, to find some compromise. Otherwise, you're not going to get anything done. And that's why Gabby is really, her organization is really doing well right now because of this approach.
Great. Anything that you think I should have, that we missed here, that we should have covered before we get to the call to action? Because there's a call to action, everybody. It takes a lot of people to move. It takes a village. So anyway, but what do we miss before we jump into the call to action?
I think one of the things that we've kind of missed is that it really takes everybody. And maybe it's a great tee up to the call to action, because I think, it has been exceptional to have people slap our back and say, great job, keep going. But to keep going means money. And in order to keep going means that you have to vote. And in order to keep going means that, you also have to, maybe you should run for office if you don't like what people are doing. We have a lot of people who come back and say, the government is against me. And I always like to remind them, I'm like, you live in a democracy. The government is you. If you don't like them, vote them out. You have a choice. You could run for office yourself. You could, participate in your local pick a party, campaign headquarters. You could, people like to, I think, complain a lot and not do anything about it. And I think for me, that's why, especially with the global DCA, I'm just tired of listening to people talk on stage at conferences, talk about how things are bad, and then not be willing to do even a little bit of change to make things better. And so I think that's where I say, again, leading into the call for action, great, get on a call with a bunch of people and complain about how bad it is. You're wasting your time. Take those steps and instead donate to our Illinois DARA campaign. Donate and support, the New Jersey Digital Asset Working Group. Donate to the groups that are doing things that make things better instead of just talking about it.
And that's one reason we get along well, is because we believe in action and working hard and getting things done. And Gabby's the hardest working person in the whole industry, but I should be your PR person, but it's all.
I know you really should. To be clear, I do not pay Nina at all to say any of this. I'm kind of amazed that she likes me after all of my hard talks that we've had and tough love.
I don't know. I'm watching some USDC move between your wallets. So anyway, I think we went right to the call to action. But maybe if you want to sharpen it up, people want to give, where should they find you? Where can they learn more about what you're doing and the status of this legislation? How can people also follow along with how these bills are progressing?
Sure. So you can hit me up, on Telegram. You can also hit me up on, just on LinkedIn, Gabriella Kusz, DM me directly. That's probably the best way. Send me your email and I'll reach out to you and we can get you looped in on our mailing list. We have meetings pretty much bi-weekly now for Illinois DARA. I usually post those on the Chai Crypto Telegram, which is about a 300 plus community of Chicago area digital assets, entrepreneurs, workers, enthusiasts, so on and so forth. I'm also on Off-Chain Global Chicago, happy to do that. And then at Crypto Gabby, I can give you my telegrams, my handles, hit me up directly and I will get you looped in. And we'd love to have your financial and also your emotional, spiritual support as well as we move forward.
Likewise.
Where can they find you, Nina? And yep.
LinkedIn, either we have a New Jersey Digital Asset Working Group, LinkedIn, or my personal. And we are thinking of setting up, a Slack channel and having more frequent communication and also educational events for legislators and trying to organize that. But we can definitely use a lot of help for sure.
Excellent. So thank you both for coming on and illuminating the listeners to what's going on at the state level, because it's real, everybody, and it's something we need to take seriously. So thanks again.
Thank you for bringing attention to this. Thank you.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're all in this together, and it does take a village.
Thank you.
It takes a community. So thanks again.